Welcome to the special program with MiJung Kim. I'm Michelle Meow, host and producer of the Michelle Meow Show at the Commonwealth Club of California, and also KBCW, a San Francisco Bay Area CBS local affiliate station. And my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm so honored to introduce to you Michelle MiJung Kim. She's a queer immigrant Korean American woman, writer, speaker, activist, educator. Well, she educates me at least, and all of you today for joining this program. And also entrepreneur. She's worked with hundreds of organizations, top executives at Fortune 500 companies, nonprofits, government agencies, and working with them in making real change. She's the author of The Wake Up, Closing the Gap Between Good Intentions and Real Change. Let's welcome Michelle MiJung Kim.
Hi, it's so wonderful to be here. What an honor to be back here again with you, Michelle. Hi, everybody. My name is Michelle MiJung Kim, and I use she, her pronouns.
So, Michelle, why don't we begin with the purpose, like our purpose, and understanding our why, especially when we're faced with a situation that is, it's injustice, it's discrimination, and we're passionate about it. I think our first reaction is that we want to do something about it. But before we make those changes, it's incredibly important to understand why you want to make those changes. Why don't we start with the personal why?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I always like to start with the why because what I found is that the why ends up driving the how and the what. So to your point, I've met so many people who have, the eagerness to jump into the work without having really questioned their own why or the organizational why. I know a lot of folks who are dialing in are making changes within organizational settings. So I think it's important for us to question both our individual personal why as well as the organizational why for doing the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Part of the conversation around why that I like to have with stakeholders and different people who are doing DEI work is one, questioning the business case. That's probably the most popular version of the why that I hear inside corporate America and tech and different organizations. I'm sure you've heard this saying where if you have more diverse workforce, then you are more likely to be innovative, profitable, and yada, yada, yada. And I find that rooting ourselves in that type of why is very limiting and short-lived because studies have shown that as soon as revenue starts to dip, the investment in this type of work starts to dwindle, and that when we look for immediate return on investment, we're often not going to get it right then and there because this work takes time and it requires sustained efforts over a long period of time. So I always say that a business case is a short-lived and a rather unsustainable why for us to drive this work, although that is something that a lot of people use to justify needing to do this work. And ultimately, I believe it's also really challenging for us to expect social justice outcomes with a why rooted in capitalism. So then what's a better why? And a better why, a slightly better why might be something that I hear often, which is it's just the right thing to do. It is a moral imperative. And while I think this is light years better than the business case why, I also think the pitfall of this why is that it distances ourselves from the injustice that we see in the world. That it's so easy for us to think of this work as almost charity work for marginalized communities rather than seeing ourselves as being a part of the system that is perpetuating injustice. So this is the second type of why that I unpack in the book on the limitations of it, right? That this, taking the moral high ground and showing up to support other people who are suffering positions ourselves as being morally superior and also distances us from the problem at hand. So for me, the most sustainable why then is a why in which it recognizes our involvement and complicity in the systems of oppression. And the one that recognizes that all of our liberation as well as suffering are tied together. So I want folks to do this work, not just because they care about people that are suffering in the world, but because they understand that that source of oppression is also coming after you, right? So when I talk to executives who are often white men, what I remind them of is um, dismantling patriarchy or sexism isn't just for the women and marginalized gender folks in your lives, but it's also for you to be able to recognize and reckon with that the systems of oppression that are oppressing women are also impacting you in the ways of men not being able to be vulnerable or stay with their kids at home. In the same way that homophobia and transphobia are not just the forces that are impacting and oppressing queer and trans people, but it's also robbing cisgender and hetero people of their ability to expand beyond the gender binary and their gender expressions. So those are some of the grappling that I like to do with organizations that I work with, as well as individuals who are trying to create change, to see that the why is so important in driving the how we do this work and how we sustain this momentum that's so often short-lived with a business case why.
I love the example that you use in the book. You're going to facilitate a workshop, I believe, and it's at a big corporation. And, like many corporations, they make you register when you get there so they can print out your name badge. And this particular corporation happened to also ask for your pronouns, which, wow, right? That's great first impression for diversity and inclusion. But when your name badge prints out, it does not include the pronouns. So you end up asking the executives that you're doing this workshop for, like, okay, what was the purpose of doing or adding pronouns at the registration if you weren't going to print it out? If you could just, explain a little bit, because like for someone like me, I learn by examples, like that, why did you do that if you didn't have the attention, right, to really make some changes?
Yeah, and I think this is a great example of how without people understanding the why, the how and the what falls short. So I believe the intention behind asking the pronouns was to ensure that people don't make assumptions around somebody's gender identity and the ways in which that they self-identify. However, I don't think the why was communicated more broadly to aid the execution of this particular practice. So, something that happens all the time is people rushing to ask, okay, just tell me what to do. Give me a checklist of things that I can do because now I'm bought in. I understand this is important. So what can I do is probably the number one question I get asked. So then it's easy for me to create a list of tasks. Here are the ways in which that you can change your policies, add the pronoun check mark on the registration form. This is how you change your health benefits, blah, 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 blah. But when we don't do the proper education of the why and we don't interrogate ourselves in terms of why this particular thing is needed and fully flesh out the impact of that particular initiative, we end up missing the mark in the implementation. And that implementation becomes very surface level and performative. So that was a great example that showed that perhaps there were good intentions on the part of perhaps the DEI committee maybe, or the front desk people who were creating the registration form. But because the entire company wasn't educated on the purpose of that, and also the much more serious reasons behind why we practice asking each other for pronouns, because it's not just for politeness sake or to make somebody feel welcome, right? It's actually rooted in the really grim reality of queer and trans people whose identities are continually threatened by the lack of safety in our society, and how the small act of asking somebody for their pronoun could improve upon so many different factors, such as youth suicide rate and bullying, harassment, and just the overall well-being for a particular person. And that's why we do this, right? It's not just so that we can check a box. Although I think the rush to want to do something can sometimes create these outcomes that are not met with or matched by the cultural transformation that we also require when these types of changes are introduced.
We're definitely going to touch on, the transformation and some advice and some suggestions that you will have for us later when we talk about lasting change. The last question I have for you on, really understanding your why is with regards to the workplace and what I wanted to ask was, why we should galvanize support from folks in the workplace, especially, when it's folks that may not share the same experiences. And you touched a little bit about this, the positive outcome of homogenization, but when it comes to people who think alike or they share similar experiences, and not necessarily people of the same ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation, and with that we really should be mindful of the intersectional issues that affect those types of demographics, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the intersectionality, the point about intersectionality is so important and yet so often forgotten. And I think it's also rooted in some of the things that we just talked about in terms of the why, being that all of our liberation as well as our struggles are so inextricably tied to one another's. So when we think about breaking down the silos of our struggles, and I think I see this even inside queer and trans people's, queer and trans communities, right? When we do events that cater only to a particular demographic of queer and trans people, whether it is, white, able-bodied, cisgender, queer men, versus really being able to touch on the myriad of experiences within the queer and trans community, including race, class, ability, all the different identity markers. I think we end up with solutions that are a lot more comprehensive and complete and enriching for the entire group of people. So I think that's why it's so important for us to ensure that the why that we are working on, working off of, are inclusive of all of these different communities and the recognition that all of our struggles are connected.
So let's talk about workplace accountability and what the process looks like, and how we ensure that there's genuine care and repair that does not cause further harm. And I love this section of the book. It's called Showing Up. And we start with centering the marginalized. Let's talk about how we center the marginalized, especially in a corporate setting.
Yeah. This is such an important principle for doing social justice work and diversity, equity, and inclusion work, the principle of always centering the most marginalized. And I think there is a danger to misunderstanding this term and this phrase of centering the most marginalized, where I've seen people use it as almost what some folks call oppression Olympics, where we are trying to use this as a weapon to diminish or trivialize people's experiences of being marginalized because they're seen as less oppressed than others. And I think that's a trap that we need to be careful of. But essentially, for me, centering the most marginalized really means that we need to, one, recognize that there are different ways in which that we are experiencing systems of oppression. And when those things compound because of our different marginalized identities, that we need to be able to recognize that, and that unless we solve for all of those intersections, that our solutions are going to be incomplete. So in the context of anti-Asian hate, for example, it would be incomplete for us to only listen to and work on the issues that are facing, light-skinned East Asian people. In order for us to actually address the full scope of the issue, we need to also be mindful of how casteism and the colorism impact the AAPI community, and to really understand and center the experiences of those, not just who are often seen as representatives of the community, but who are marginalized even within the marginalized community, who are darker skinned Asian people, brown and Black Asian people, Muslim people, and queer and trans Asian people. So unless we center those experiences, whatever outcomes that we get, whatever solutions that we come up with are going to be short-sighted, incomplete, and not comprehensive. So that's what I mean by centering the most marginalized. And in the corporate setting, in a workplace setting, I think we have so many different ways to do that. One is by ensuring that marginalized people who hold those marginalized identities, especially at the cross-section of multiple systems of oppression, are given real power to lead. Because the principle really centers on this idea that those who are most impacted by the systems of oppression also have the most amount of wisdom and awareness on how to overcome it and to solve it. So without their not only participation, but leadership and power through which they can create change, we're not going to be able to get to the solutions that we are wanting. And I think this is a danger also of sometimes people thinking that the mere inclusion or accommodation of marginalized people will get us there, rather than shifting and redistributing the power that is in existence inside organizations. So I think that's really what it means to center the most marginalized, not just including their perspective or accommodating them, but it's about shifting the power dynamic so that they have the power to create change. And another sort of very, day-to-day example of centering the most marginalized is the need to decenter ourselves. This happens a lot in the workplace, where we put a lot of additional educational and emotional labor burden on marginalized people, sometimes without even their consent or agency of wanting to do that work. So on the one hand, we want to be able to give people who are marginalized the power to shift and create change. But if that's not something that people are signing up to do, then we need to ensure that we're not putting that expectation on top of somebody's full-time job to do that work. And that's where, having people who are skilled, who are consenting, who are practicing agency come in to do that work is so important. And I've seen so often how we re-traumatize marginalized people by asking them to do work of educating people using their traumatic lived experiences for the benefit of those in positions of power and privilege, right? That is not a good example of how we center the most marginalized folks. Rather, we want to ensure we are respecting people's boundaries, agency, and their that we're not tokenizing the folks who are in these corporate settings, who are often experiencing multiple forms of oppression as one of the few, if not the only, person of color, queer, trans person, disabled person, and so forth. And the last example I'll use, because this happens so often in the corporate setting, is tone policing. That would be the opposite of centering the most marginalized folks in terms of, this is another example of us centering ourselves when we ask people to tone it down, when we ask them to talk to us more nicely, more professionally, or more civilly, so that we can have a dialogue when we're being called out for our mistakes. That's another example that I see so often inside corporate America and in the workplace in general, or even in our daily lives when we make mistakes and we get really defensive about being called out, that we inadvertently end up centering our comfort and our desire to be seen as a good person instead of centering the needs of the marginalized person who have been harmed. So those are some concrete examples in and outside of the workplace that we should be mindful of when it comes to practicing this principle of centering the most marginalized.
I like shift resources and redistribute power. So especially, when we have, like, for example, Asian Pacific Heritage Month or LGBTQ Pride Month. And, when people do say that they can speak on these issues that affect our community, that it's not necessarily asking them to volunteer their time to do it as well.
For
so
free.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Change through language. Now, this is, to me at least, fairly easy thing to do, especially in the, first stages of making some change. Talk to us about, changes through language.
Yeah. I talk about the importance of language and the ways that we use language to shape our culture, and how language literally changes our brain. There have been so many different types of research that I was fascinated by when I was writing the chapter specifically on language, around how having access to certain types of language and vocabulary impacts the way that we see things in the world. So, for example, in some cultures, there are more ways to describe different colors. And if you have a particular language for that, you're more likely to see and spot that color that you and I may not be able to spot, because the language that we have is limited to, black or white or blue and red. So that's just a simple example of how language literally rewires our brains to create more possibilities in the world. And I think as queer people who've been observing the changes of our language and labels and identities, I love celebrating different ways in which that we get to self-identify, and how empowering that experience could be. And I think I also can speak for many of us when we talk about the the weight of language when it comes to harm and the potential for harm that could be caused by the use of derogatory language or appropriative language, right? So I think language is such a powerful tool at our disposal if we use it in the right way. And I think it's, to your point, sometimes the shortcut that people want to have to signal that they have done the work. So, the request that I get often from leaders is, okay, can you just give me a list of things that I'm allowed to say versus I'm not allowed to say? And I refuse to do that because language is, one, ever evolving. And two, again, if we don't understand the why behind the importance of inclusive language, then we're going to fall short when we make mistake and somebody call us out and we didn't realize that we don't know the latest language. And we end up then faulting someone for either giving us the wrong list or for calling us out when we have good intentions. So again, I go back to not just the surface level, what to say, what not to say, because those things will change depending on the context and depending on the person that you're talking to. And rather focusing on why it is that we focus so much on the language, why it is that we, more beyond just having the vocabulary list, that the spirit of our need to adjust our language and our desire to meet people where they want to be defined as and how they want to be spoken to, that's the spirit that I want to teach people. Like, I don't want people to be so afraid of saying the wrong things and end up feeling paralyzed by not having the full list of vocabulary, right? Because we're never going to get there. We're never going to know all the language, the most up-to-date language in all the different marginalized communities and or individual preferences. And therefore, what we can learn is, how do we ask questions? How do we check ourselves when we've made a mistake? And what kinds of homework and research can we do to stay up to date? And ultimately, what is the most respectful and dignifying experience that we can offer to someone we care about? And how do I express that in the language that is most aligned to the communities that I'm trying to be in solidarity with?
Yeah, and a good rule of thumb I like to stick with, especially if I go into a new setting, is trying to use what you call in the book, universal inclusive language. And that's just the kind of stuff, like if I walk into a room and I generalize for myself, it looks like mostly men identifying people, I might walk in there and think that it's totally comfortable to high five folks and be like, hey man, which that's not universal inclusive language.
Right. And even, I've been saying queer during the session, and I know that some folks in our community don't identify with that term or are, there's historical trauma associated with that term, even though there have been efforts to reclaim the word queer. So I really think that this nuance around inclusive language is an important one for people to reckon with, that it's not about sticking to a rigid set of list of terms, but the care that we have for one another in ensuring that I am using the words that are most able to show my care for the person that you're talking to. I think that's where we can start, and we can always adjust and adapt as time goes by.
Awesome. Disrupting the pattern. I love this idea. I mean, I think there's a lot of work that goes into it, but talk to us about disrupting the pattern.
Okay, yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah.
So this particular chapter was all about how we, one, spot harmful patterns that recreate the cycle of violence over and over again, and how we all need to recognize the power that we have to be able to disrupt it. And it's all about sort of giving people the tools and the contextual analysis they need to be able to intervene when they observe harm, especially at an interpersonal or organizational settings. So for me, I've seen over and over how the patterns of violence and oppression repeats itself all across different spheres of influence, meaning, in the workplace, out in the streets, in our personal lives. And the same patterns, when we don't connect the dots, can be missed. And, an example could be when we talk about Black Lives Matter movement, and people associate that only as something that happens out in the street between a Black individual and a police officer. But it's a lot broader than that, what we're really talking about in terms of the pattern of anti-Blackness and anti-Black violence that we see out in the streets repeats itself in our intimate relationships, in our family settings, in our schools and our places of worship, as well as in the workplace. So one, I want people to recognize a pattern of violence that happens in different settings. In what ways is our organization repeating the pattern of anti-Blackness inside the workplace, and in what are the ways in which that we are engaging in over policing of Black people inside our organization, whether through its over surveilling, or there's always, I have been in so many conversations where the standards through which people are expected to perform differ based on somebody's identities, right? And the performance criteria, because it's not clearly defined, ends up being very biased and having those biases and anti-Blackness baked into somebody's perception of somebody's work. So some of those things are how we can start to connect the dots and start to spot the patterns that repeat in different spheres. And then there are very practical things that we can do to stop harmful behaviors inside the workplace. And I share some of those tips in the book. That's very sort of practical, whether it's coming up with a one-word intervention tactic where everybody knows what to say in the moment, because those moments pass really quickly in a meeting setting, in a performance review setting, or even in an interpersonal dynamic. That we get to be aware of how to pause the conversation to be able to address the pattern so that we can disrupt it in the moment rather than afterwards. And I also, one more thing I'll share about disrupting the pattern is this concept of the second courageous. And I love this, even though I came up with it, because this is the pattern that I've seen play out in so many different ways, where people end up exercising the courage to interrupt harm in the moment, but they end up getting getting a pushback from the source of that harm, and then there's nobody else who's going to back them up. So then they have risked their own safety and their reputation to do the right thing, and yet when there was resistance from that other side, there was no one else who could back me up. So then the pattern continues despite somebody having tried to intervene. So it's not something. So when it comes to disrupting the pattern, when it comes to us intervening when there is harm happening, sometimes it's not enough for one person to do that, right? We need more people to have each other's back. So that's what I call the second courageous. We need multiple different second courageous people to show up to back up the first courageous person who may have taken that risk to show up and to live in alignment with their values, so that we don't let them stand in the fire alone.
I wish we could go on and on, but we've got time for you to talk about one last tool, which is creating our own liberatory tools. And I love this point, and especially around reimagining everything as quickly as you could, because I'll just tell everybody, hey, get a copy of the book and you can read more about it. Talk to us about creating our own tools.
Creating our own liberatory tools. I wrote this chapter specifically in response to what happened last year in Atlanta with the Atlanta shooting, and in order to contextualize why it is that we need to create our own liberatory tools and not rely upon the tools that have been developed by the systems of oppression that we so often denounce. And the one particular example that I use is the use of the legal system in the United States and policing. and how those things have been limiting in terms of how we can actually create safety for marginalized people. So when it comes to responding to anti-Asian violence, there have been a lot of different types of responses to how we can stop the violence and also to restore safety for our communities. And one such response has been, we need more investment in policing. We need more security. We need more police officers surveilling and patrolling our neighborhoods. We need to invest in harsher criminal sentencing laws and hate crime laws. And I, along with many other grassroots organizers and community activists who've been doing this work for a long time, as well as abolitionists who are trying to really showcase the gaps in our legal system and the justice system, are saying and noticing is how those tools that are developed by systems of supremacy and what we've seen as being even more violent than the violence that we see on a day-to-day basis, how that solution is not sufficient for us to keep us safe. So while some people may think that having more police officers in the street in Chinatown may keep some Asian people safe, the reality is that that makes the condition unsafe for so many other Asian people, undocumented Asian people, queer and trans Asian people, darker skinned Asian people, sex workers, and people who are often criminalized. It does not make them safe. So in order for us to create real safety and sustained conditions of justice, we need to create our own tools and not continue to go back to the tools that have been birthed by systems of oppression. So that's really the crux of my argument. And my exploration and my ask of people is, how can we continue to reimagine the tools that we can use to serve our communities that do not rely on the paradigms developed by systems of oppression? And that goes, towards the workplace and our communities, right? In the workplace, what can we do that doesn't rely on the predefined structures and standards that have been set by systems that we denounce? And how do we practice imagining what is possible outside of those oppressive paradigms so that we can create truly just and equitable conditions using equitable and just tools?
Thank you so much, Michelle. I know there is a lot, and I promise you, if you pick up a copy of the book, there's a lot that you can learn from it. And so pick up the Wake Up, Closing the Gap Between Good Intentions and Real Change. So the last thing I wanted you to touch on is it's a lot of work, right? Like, I hope that you all had learned something, and you might feel like you've just woken up, but the reality is that we have to wake up every day to do this work, and it can get hard, but we'll always remember that we're human. So you make some points at the very end of the book, and it's finding joy in community and some promises. So let's end with that. What are those promises?
Yeah. Well, so the joy part is so important because I don't think we can do this work from a place of only anger and trauma. And I realized for a long time I was doing just that. And I burnt out, and I ended up really struggling with feeling jaded and cynical about what's possible inside these systems. So I don't take this find joy in community imperative lightly. I think it is an imperative for us to be able to continue this work together, and for us to not burn out or become jaded and cynical that change is not happening quickly enough, or that it's too big of a problem for us to solve. And I get immense joy from being in community with people who are values aligned, who believe and practice that hope that change is possible. And the three promises that I end the book with is as much of a reminder for myself as it is something that I'm asking of the readers and everybody who's doing change work. Number one is the promise to be honest. How can we be as honest as possible with ourselves around our own values, what we are willing or unwilling to give up in order to create the change that we want to see in the world? How can we be more honest about the stories that we've lived, not just the stories of our own struggles, but the stories of our privileges and the hidden stories that we sometimes don't remember because we don't think that we've lived them, but that are also part of our stories. And the second promise is around accountability. How can we stay accountable to our own integrity and our values? And how can we be accountable to each other and the communities that we're trying to be in solidarity with? And the last thing is promising to be human. I think it's so easy for us to intellectualize this work and forget that this work, at the root of it, is about human lives. We do this work because we care about one another and our broader community and ourselves and our humanity. And this work is not something that we do in order to gain more profit for our company or in order for us to get the ally cookie. It's the work of our healing. It's the work of our trauma being recognized and healed. So I hope that people remember to be human when it comes to this work and to humanize the work that we do every single day.
Thank you so much, Michelle, MiJung, Kim, and thank you to all of you for finding joy and community with us today and for being human. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.